Hello, good afternoon, everybody. And many thanks for being here for our first roundtable discussion. And some of you might know that I'm a teacher. So if anyone cannot hear us properly, then please come closer, because we don't have technical opportunity to be louder than I'm speaking right now. Is it okay? Okay. So thanks everybody, and I'm really honored and thrilled to be the moderator of this panel discussion. And there are many personal and professional reasons for that. Let me introduce the panelists first, starting with Kocze, the chair of the Romani Studies program and the academic director of the Roma Graduate Preparation Program, RGPP. Prem Kumar Rajaram, professor of sociology and social anthropology, the former academic director of the Roma Graduate Preparation Program, the director in Oli. Michael Kozakowski, the director of the Yehuda Elkana Center for Teaching, Learning and Higher Education Research at CEU. Margareta Matache, joining us online from the US, director of the Roma program, FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, Harvard University. Thank you, Magda, for making it. Jan Selling, head of Department of Critical Romani Studies, Sodertorn University, and David Ridout, director of the Center for Academic Writing, the former English director of the Roma Access Program, the Roma Graduate Preparation Program, and the Roma Language Program at CEU. And we have many things to discuss, and many thanks to Judith for raising other important and thought-provoking questions in her keynote. And before we turn to those and other questions, my first question to our panelists would be that when we talk about access programs, how do you define access? Access to what? Access to whom? How? What is the reason behind? What is the rationale? Or the overarching goal? And David, if we could start with you, as have the most access programs on
Okay, thank you very much, Vicky. Yeah, I was just thinking now about access, something that was, when we started 2004, so we started maybe in 2002 thinking about, it's called the Roma Access Program then, and what we wanted to achieve with this program, and one of the key things we were thinking, and after talking to many people, was that access shouldn't mean about entry into education. It should be, access should be into being able to enter into the educational space and be able to have the skills and the confidence to be able to take part in the education, because we were seeing lots of other models where there were access was a very simple stroke of a pen. We will give quotas, we will allow X number of people to get into a university, and then we would hear stories of them being, oh, they're only in there because of the quota and stuff, blah, 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 blah. So that wasn't the access we were looking for. We were very much thinking we want to have a program where people will be able to learn skills, to inhabit the talents that they had, to be able to take part on an equal footing, so have access into a space on an equal footing, and it's not a place where other students who've had the privilege of certain kinds of education are seen as smarter or whatever. And so that's something which was very much in the thinking about access in the beginning. So an equal access of opportunity, not just to enter, but to go through a whole process. And that's how we thought about the curriculum when we designed the first Roma Access program. I could go on, but Prem, maybe something, and then I'll come back. Or
please, Prem.
So I think David and I think very similarly about these issues. David has been in access programs longer than I have. I joined the access programs after David asked me on the bus. Coming back from school, I mean, for me, it's also, I mean, we've heard earlier, and we know from students that the Roma graduate professional program have all been transformative. I think it's also personally transformative for me. So for me, it was very easy, yes. And I said yes without knowing what I was getting into. But working in the Roma graduate preparation program, as it was called at that time, has really formed me as an academic, as a teacher, as a researcher, and I think also probably sounds, you know, maybe a little bit, but also very much as a person. It's helped me think through my politics and my idea of the university and the purpose of the university. And, you know, really to, as David says, when we talked about access, it was never about bringing people into a preformed system and its hierarchies. It was very hard to not, it was very hard to avoid that. There are hierarchies in the university. We can construct, in this university, in any university, we can construct as inclusive a program as we like, and as critical as we like about access, the hierarchies remain. So access has to, I think, access programs have to do these two things: open up space for students and understand the hierarchies to which they're bringing students into and seek to transform these. It's not one person giving access. I think, as Yehuda said earlier, it's not about a gift, it's a right. And I think the way that I think that we also saw access programs doing what David mentioned was as allowing people to access the rights that they have.
Can you speak up a bit, because some people have difficulty to hear you? Thank you.
It's always the case with me. I don't think I can be loud enough. So we could get a mic.
The micro is
but I'll try my best. Sorry to everyone online. But so as I was saying, access has to be two-way. It's not just one way. It's not one person. It's not a benevolent gift of the university. I think that has to be very clearly stated. It's about access programs are programs that enable people to access their rights. At the same time, the university should see this as an opportunity to understand and address its hierarchies about why inequality, as this conference says it, why inequality has been reproduced and keeps being reproduced. So it has to be two-way.
Okay, it is encouraging me to be the next person, since I'm also an academic director, the present, the current, not the former. And the way as we think about access, I think it's more political than preparatory, I would say. So that's why we always argue that we need to call it like as an access program, because it's not just about preparing students to go to higher education, to study there, to have all kinds of academic skills, but we are, paving the way for the next generations and forthcoming generations as well. And these people, I think, who entered to higher education, they did something very political. So they offered the model, they opened up a space, and they created some kind of opportunities for our Romani students, maybe the guys, Mia's daughter who will come, then hopefully it's going to be easier. And also, I think it's very important to mention the difference between equality and equity, because at the university, we always talking about equality, and it came up at our class as well, right? And the notion of equity, actually, it's a kind of close to fairness and justice, is much more, right? And it's a distinct idea from the equality. In particular, it will not always involve either equality of treatment or equality of outcome, right? Because we have to treat everybody equally. So actually, it may be fair to treat people in a very different ways, right? Because these people have a specific needs. They face several obstacles in their life, and that's what we call, like sociologists, structural inequality or structural obstacles, structural violence, and we have to address it through education and in higher education, and also, I mean, just like this is the discourse today that everything's changing, and universities are changing as well, and maybe there at some places there's an expansion, but this kind of higher education expansion does not necessarily translate into increased opportunity for disadvantaged populations. So I think we always have to think about it. How are we going to change? How are we going to change the university structure? And how are we going to open up the spaces? Does it really provide a meaningful equity, using the word, for those as well who are coming from such a disadvantaged places where most of our students are coming from. And also, as we know, that entry to higher education institution is regulated by two very important mechanisms, right? One is the academic performance. They have to be the best. They have to be the best achiever, academic excellence. That's what we safeguard our institutions. And the next one is more economic, the tuition fees. So who will afford to cover such a high tuition fees and to study in higher education? And I think through the access programs, that's what we try to address. So prepare them academically, academic performance should be eligible and good. And also provide scholarship and financial support to study, and not allow them to work and to gain some additional income. So these are really important.
Magda, could you go next, please?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so sorry I'm not there with you. I know that many friends and colleagues are there, and I would have loved to see you all. But let me just start by saying that yesterday, Palestinians commemorated the 1948 Nakba, a catastrophe that continues and takes lives every single day. And today, Romani people observe Romani Resistance Days to remember the uprising of the Roman prisoners of Auschwitz-Birkenau on May 16, 1944. So I think that symbolically, this conference it's very relevant in this context. But my short response to you would be, Vicky, that what we want or what we talk about is access to power and access to power resources across all facets of life to ensure justice, reparatory justice, and redistributive justice. And I say that because throughout the history of Europe, the entry sign, particularly the welcome sign to the doors of schools, has consistently been denied to Roma children. And I use this metaphor of an entrance door to connect it to the origins of the word access, which comes from the Latin accessus, which means entrance. But basic linguistic detail may not be relevant yet. I use it to underscore the historical tie between power and access to education across Europe. I guess the question is, who has historically been granted the privilege of available and tailored education. And we know that in the past, it was mostly the elites, the priestly caste and the aristocracy, and public education became more of a general thing only in the 19th and the 20th century. Yet public education has been a institution designed for Gaje, although less so for Gaje girls and the poor. And the era of nation state didn't bring much in terms of support for Roma education or this door to Roma education. So I think that in this context, it's understandable why access has been a major priority for the contemporary Roma movement. And even like if we were to zoom in and look specifically at the preparatory programs like the Roma Access Program, I would say that the program has not only opened a schoolyard or the gates to a schoolyard, but also paved the way for Roma youth to access, succeed, and retain in graduate programs. And I think that this was one of the main points that one of the speakers made earlier as well, because this is not only about opening that door, but how do we make sure that these people can stay in the program, that the program is welcoming enough, the staff is prepared enough in an anti-racist manner. And I would just conclude perhaps by saying that it's remarkable that in fact 8 out of 10 RGBP graduates have been accepted into master's programs. Thus, the CEU program has grown well beyond access, and that progression is evident also in the changes of the program's name over time. And I guess that, part of your question was also related to who has access, and I guess that's a more complicated and a long question, which of course would lead us to talk about marginalization and the most marginalized and the most oppressed, but probably I'll stop here and we can talk about that later.
Many thanks, Magda. Michael, could you please?
Sure. So this is, I was also thinking about this question of access, and I would fully agree with Magda about the broader stakes here. I wanted to focus, though, my comments on perhaps a narrower idea of access, and that is specifically access to what type of education. And thinking that we often speak about access to education, it's broadly acknowledged in many constitutions in the world as a right of the individual, but it doesn't necessarily specify what type of education and to what type of support. I think that it's sufficient to talk about access to higher education.
Can you please use the mic? Can you please
use? We have none, unfortunately.
We don't have a mic.
You have a baby in the room. It's totally okay.
No mic, but I will try to speak up. The access to higher education has been an initiative, particularly the past couple of years at the EU level in terms of lifelong learning, continuous learning, etc. But that doesn't strike me as sufficient either. What many of the programs here at CEU and elsewhere are talking about access to higher education, degree programs in higher education. And I think this is important, not because those other things, such as power, restorative justice, aren't important, but I think there's something very specific about what a degree program offers. One of them is knowledge, right? Knowledge, skills, attributes, dispositions. University degree programs also offer credentials and a path into a labor market, right? They are also about social relationships, and this is where power often enters into the equation. And unfortunately, we know that even in a society such as Austria, where almost 50% of school leavers this year will attend higher education institutions, not all higher education institutions are alike, nor is that distribution representative of society. And so ministers go around and they talk about abstract goals of making universities more representative of the diversity of society. And when you have 50% of school leavers going to university, what would it mean that 50% are not? And often this is framed in through collective rights. So we talk about the legitimacy of institutions. For example, why would it be lawful for a police department to have ethnic-based quotas? Well, the answer is often about the trust when it comes to power and violence and all the rest, right? I mean, if someone is arresting you, you need to have confidence that you're a representative of society and that you, in some ways, could see yourself in the eyes of the state. We also talk about the distribution of these limited resources, for example, the 50%. But, and here's where I deeply regret not hearing Judith's talk due to other readings this morning about individual rights. There's something deeply insufficient and inadequate about framing access and framing through the collective. We need to think about access through the lens of individual rights. And here we have, if I go back to access to what, we have this widely acknowledged right of access to education, but not necessarily access to a degree program. And we need to think about, even if that is not a legal right, would we want to think about it in terms of moral and ethical claims? Because if, I'm just going to hypothesize that university degrees are a widely accepted social good, right? So for all of those reasons that I mentioned, the knowledge, the job market, the economic prospects, but also the social and power relationships that they offer, they're largely publicly funded. So if we have something that's widely acknowledged as a public good that is publicly funded, would an individual have any rights to said good? And on what terms? And how would we reconcile the fact that only 50% actually are going to universities and are often sort of tracked out of the system at a very, very early age? So what types of claims, if you wanted to acknowledge this as a public good, and potentially as an individual right, what would you have to hypothesize about the pathways, at which times, under which circumstances, with minimal barriers? And what would be sort of the obligations and of other members of society to make those pathways possible? So I might pause there. I will give you the mic.
Thank you. I don't know how to turn it on.
No, just.
It's like this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I will start from another end. But firstly, I must say I'm very happy to be here because CEU is like the mothership of critical Romani studies, and without these programs we are talking about, the field would not exist. That's my perspective. And I want to address this question from an ideological, critical perspective, maybe, that the little word critical indicates a specific approach, and where Gypsy Laurism and the so-called Romani studies are obsessed with cultural differences, and often explain the social and educational position of Roma by referring to Roma culture. We are perhaps more interested in discussing structural obstacles and forms of racism. And going back to this European perspective, I'm talking from my position from Sweden, and there I can see that the result has been and still is it's a structure developed from an outdated paradigm, that of minorization and what has been called Roma inclusion, and where sort of the idea which comes through many times is that, and I hear and read this often in Sweden, that the problem is that the Roma are alien to education and that there are no educated Roma, and we have to prove the opposite again and again. So, and there have, from this paradigm, which Ian Hancock excellently addressed many years ago with his book titled Danger Educated Gypsy, the result has been that we don't have this kind of access programs in Sweden, but there are some programs where it's said to promote higher education for Roma at universities, but it's not actually higher education. It's more lower education, if we might say. There is no support at all for Roma graduate students and to promote the many who want to come into this. And we have tried to address this in some years and to challenge this in terms of founding critical Romani studies with the collaboration of Harvard, Magda, and CEU and others. But it's very hard to change because those structures are so, it is an industry, if you say. There are university institutions, there are scholars, there are politicians who live from maintaining the system. So that's that's the challenge, and that's why I think it's also important to address this in ideological terms. Thank you.
Many thanks, yeah. And turning to the panelists, as much as possible within our limitations, whether there is anything you have heard and would like to react to, because I could see people taking notes, nodding, so having a discussion as much as possible. No.
I'll say something. And Magda was talking about the metaphorical entry door, and it made me. You talked about the entry door, the metaphorical entry door, and this idea, and it made me think. In 2003, I was in Romania. We were interviewing for the very first Roma Access Program cohort, and I went to OSF with Michael Stewart, and we were going to do the interviews, and there was a group of people outside of the building who weren't being allowed in by the OSF people in 2003. It was snowing, it was December, and we're like, who are these people? We go in, where are the students? We're going to interview, and it's like, oh, they haven't arrived. And it's like, and who are these people? Oh, they're just a bunch of gypsies outside. And they were the people coming for the interview. So this was, it wasn't a metaphorical entry door. It was like exactly how it was then. And that's one of the things why it's so great to look around today and see 20 years later, we have the Romani studies, and it's inhabited the space. And we're not in the situation as in 2004 when we had the first students, and I didn't really understand at the time. Sorry?
I was the first Roman student.
For the program. Yeah.
But there was no any access program.
Yeah, so the first access students, I mean, and at the first graduation, there were students amongst the cohort who didn't want Roma on the board you put in front of the photo. And it was like other students didn't understand that. I didn't really understand that, but in reflection, when, I remember the story of them, people being denied entry by the institution into the building, or when the students arrived, some professor lost money in the canteen and it turned to the Roma students. It must have been one of them. So it's very different, and it's great what the program has done, and with the Romani studies now, that it's not just going towards this assimilation, it's going towards this really good accommodation. So.
You have touched upon many things, and you did raise many things, and 20 years historical looking back. But still we are at different stages. It seems to me that very often we encounter this problem that we have to kind of justify why any kind of educational intervention is needed, whatever you might want to call it. And you did already is researching the limitations of these interventions or support or access programs. some of you touched upon political, legal, moral justifications or brandings for these programs. But if you could come up with the major moral, legal, political, social, even economic or knowledge-based reasons or rationale behind the need for these programs. And I would say that whoever would like to come first is most welcome.
I can go first if you.
Let's listen to Prem and Magda. Could you?
I'll let Magda go first. And then...
Okay, then Magda, please. Sorry.
Should I'm not sure what the conversation was.
Yeah, go ahead, Magda.
Okay. So maybe just being inspired by some of the words that you mentioned. I think Angela talked about fairness, justice, equality. Then we talked about collective injustices, individual rights, and so on. And probably in that framework, I suggest we critically, as Jan said, analyze access programs by linking them to concepts and rationales drawn from liberal political philosophy, particularly theories of justice and theories of anti-racism. If we were to go back to John Rawls and his theory of justice, we know that it has been seen as this renaissance in the theory of justice, right? Marking a departure from utilitarianism, which focused more on the idea of the greatest number of people, the gauge majorities in our case. However, anyone could understand that the idea of the greatest number of people meant basically people holding power, resources, and hegemony. And I think that in response to this school of thought, if we were to think about Rawls and Fraser later and others, they have framed justice as fairness, which Angela talked about, equity and equality, arguing that justice was the basic structure of a society and institutions. And in particular, Rawls focused a lot on, on the development of new law, new just laws and institutions. So basically, we are talking about a form of liberalism that prioritized individual human rights and equality of opportunity. And I say all this to say that to an extent, the access programs, being them the Roma access program at CEU or other programs in particular countries, but also our emphasis on anti-discrimination laws and targeted Roma policies in the past 30 years have followed this theory of justice, this liberal theory of justice, which Amartya Sen, a mentee of Rawls, critiques because he says, well, it's not just about laws and institutions, and we've seen that with the Roma case as well. It's also about voices and participation of unheard voices. And again, from that perspective, if we were to look at the access programs, particularly the Roma access program at the CEU and later on the RGPP and so on, these programs have also partially addressed the need for historically unheard voices to be at the table, to occupy spaces of power. However, perhaps building on Jan Selling's comment, I would agree with Jamaican political philosopher Charles Mills that traditionally liberalism has inherited a white perspective and continues to uphold white supremacy. So we have to critique liberalism. And I think that even more the liberal focus on individualism, and one of you mentioned earlier, individual rights, has long neglected the collective nature of the inequities and injustices impacting Roma education. So what I'm saying is that broadly in the case of the Roma people, including in access to education, liberalism has failed to account for and address the history, legacies, and continuities of structural anti-Roma racism. Essentially, in Europe, we follow the liberal theory of racism, which can be traced back to the work of Magnus Hirschfeld in the 1930s, who thought that racist beliefs drive individuals to create racist institutions. However, I follow more the radical alternative to liberal anti-racism led by CLR James, and then Martinican intellectuals like Aimé Césaire or Frantz Fanon, who argue that oppression precedes racist beliefs. And I think that this is something that we have to change in the way in which we think about Roma and Roma education, and more so because it's not enough to change racist beliefs and to think that racists are the one who disturb the function of a liberal society, but it is a system of oppression. And as Frantz Fanon would put it, we need to start again. So what I'm suggesting is that we, the Roma people, particularly those with some level of access to Gajo power and institutions and narrative, may want to rethink our vision and expand our focus from access, individuals and individual rights to anti-racism, anti-oppression, fair distribution and redistribution of power and power resources.
Thank you. So perhaps also to connect to how Magda ended, maybe I just want to say two things first. I think it's important to refuse in the beginning the call to justify access programs or programs that are designed to foster equity. The call to justify equity is often you end up in a dead end. It's happened. We've seen it with Roma Access Program. We've seen it with the Open Learning Initiative, where you start trying to justify something in terms that you don't have full access to. So the vocabulary is there already. The terms by which something is rendered important or meaningful is there already. And the Roma Access Program, the Open Learning Initiative, which worked with displaced people, struggled to make themselves relevant in other people's terms. And that's a problem. And then we enter into cycle of domination. And also it perpetuates what we've all talked about the problem of access. You enter into something that's already there, and you enter in a position of subordinacy. So I think, first of all, I think it's important collectively to try to refuse this call for justification. It's difficult to do. We do it when we write grant applications. We do it when we try and get a university to support us, including this university. And we know that this university in particular has not been as supportive as it should be for access programs, whether for refugee and displaced people or people of Romani origin. So that's one thing. I think it's important to refuse the justification. Second, I think it's important to see and really maybe connecting to what Magda is saying, to think about how I don't see in European liberalism a great deal to hang on to. I think, especially now, just over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and over the last 4 or 5 months, Magda mentioned the Nakba. We've seen the contradictions of European liberalism, which Fanon pointed to a long time ago. Fanon talked about the violence underpinning our liberal projects, and I think it's important to be aware of this, to call to mind and to focus and ask how these contradictions have emerged and how they've remained invisible for many people for a long time, not invisible to the people who felt these contradictions, whether as racialized people or because on basis of gender or class. So I think it's important to understand how universities can be part of a structure of domination, even without intending to. And this whole entire structure of domination is part of a complex social formation. I mean, this is following a Marxist and Paulo Freire and Gramsci frame of this, which is that there are many participants in the structure of domination, including those who are benevolent, who want to be benevolent. And it's complex and it's not easy to analyze, but I think it's important to try to understand how the university can perpetuate that, how cultural institutions can perpetuate that by, for example, asking people to justify their legitimacy in the university, or asking the people who fund, who want to raise money for them or want to build programs for them. And so I think it's important, first of all, to refuse, or at the very least to question this call for that we need to perform a certain legitimacy, or that access programs need to perform a certain legitimacy.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I agree completely with what you're saying. About a month ago, we had a workshop at Sodertorn University about everyday racism, minority stress, and internalized anti-Gypsyism, as we called it. Among the speakers were, we will hear later today, also Simona Torotkoe and Sunita Mehmetovic also. And at that, just to give one example, that it's what happens when you are sort of accessed through this door. I mean, the first thing is it's not, there are material and formal borders or blockages, but there are also immaterial ones. And once you're inside, what happens then? There were, for example, one who is now a psychologist. He went 5 years to university, and he was the only Roma student as aware of at that university. And that was to him like a pressure, because he knew that there is all this kind of anti-Gypsy sentiment subconsciously or openly. So that's one thing to be aware of. I think what happens after accessing, and I think to relate to the talk before our panel as well, that it's important to as much as we can to change academia from within and create spaces where there is room for well, it's a question about human rights and dignity, really, and to create that kind of spaces, I think. And there will be a starting point to discuss and educate and research about the visions of a more just society like that.
Oh, Michael, sorry. Michael?
Seemed like a better idea, but I don't know. Can you hear me online? Okay, so I just wanted to come back to one of these. I think we were opening up a very fruitful discussion about the relationship between collective rights and individual rights. And I think one of the things that's very useful, and I would agree with all that's been said in terms of the potential for liberalism, both historically and continuously, to embed oppression, racism, other structures of injustice. I fully agree with calls for thinking about voice and thinking about redistribution, what it would actually, where we need to think about collective rights. I would, in structural conditions, the Marxian case, I would make a case, though, that we should still think about individual rights in this mix, and that there's still some potential for individual rights, either as a moral commitment to sort of an individual rights philosophy, or as a strategic commitment, given that society is largely based on sort of a liberal tradition. And I guess I would make 3 points, whether this is just strategic and tactical or actually comes from commitment, that we should pay attention to individuals in this story, not at the expense of groups, but in addition to groups. One is that individuals have human rights, and this is broadly recognized. And individuals often have standing in courts and other avenues for seeking redress and justice. In places where groups don't always have standing, but usually individuals are recognized as having standing. That doesn't mean that individual action is more effective than collective action. Often collective action is more. But I just want to make the case that individuals do have, are recognized by the law and as moral agents. And very few people would deny that. The second thing is, we need to think about what justice means, not just on a group level, but on an individual level. I don't think any of us in this room would be satisfied if a group were satisfied, but some individuals were not, right? So at the end of the day, we are still looking for individual justice in addition to collective justice. And I think one of the real challenges of thinking about access programs in higher education and the many, many systemic and structural barriers to higher education is to think about, would any individual and would every individual have a meaningful, credible pathway to a higher education degree? And until we're satisfied that we can answer yes, we have work to do. So I don't think this is in contradiction to anything, but I would leave space for the individual in this story too.
I think it's not either or, like individual or collective rights. So certainly both rights have the space, and but I don't want to follow on that line. Rather, what I would like to pick up that which was somehow partly touched upon by Magda, but not really articulated, the epistemic violence, actually, what we are experiencing in higher education. And up until now, I think it was really hard to imagine, almost it was unthinkable to have Roma, right, at CU, in a higher education, as a scholars, as a thinkers, as a people who have some kind of valid knowledge, or they can contribute to the knowledge production. And I think what we were able to do, maybe it sounds too much. I'm not, as people who know me, that I'm not that kind of, right, person who would have such a high self-esteem, but I really think, or I really believe that what we created, it's a kind of new language and new conceptualization. And what critical Romani studies do is really posit the analysis of the intersected racialization of Roma, not as a separate research inquiry, not as an essentialized group, right? But rather to understand the logic of racialization as a related frame of reference in a global context. And at least many of us try to do. I know it's really hard, but it seems to me that somehow we were able to challenge and critique the constitutive epistemology, which had been very much dominant in higher education when we were talking about Roma. And actually, I would agree or concur with Barbara, was talking about the reparatory social science. And somehow I really believe that somehow we are aiming or aspiring to do something there, like as a reparatory social science, not just researching Roma and describing their situation, but do something and have these people and get them here. And going back to the point of epistemic violence and epistemic injustice, which has been coined by Miranda Fricker, and she's distinguishing between the terms of testimonial injustice from hermeneutical injustice. And in her conceptualization, testimonial injustice occurs when the speaker is not understood properly because the hearer has a lack of trust based on prejudice that hinders any kind of meaningful understanding. Hermeneutical injustice occurs when speakers cannot find the words, thoughts, and concepts that would describe their collective experience because the available biased conceptual resource constitute the structural prejudice present in the academic conceptual framework. So in both cases, due to this prejudice and cognitive gap in hermeneutical resources, the hearers, audience do not acknowledge speakers' knowledge and therefore will not understand the existence of, for instance, sexual harassment in the case of women, or as the example was given by Miranda Fricker, but in our case, the racialization as a process. We know that the debate is very contentious, but still, like when we start to talk about the importance of racialization as a theoretical concept, we used to hear that, oh, it's an obsolete thing, oh, it's not relevant, and it doesn't really explain the situation of Roma. And I think it's very much connected to the epistemic violence, the epistemic injustice, what Miranda is talking about, the hermeneutical injustice and testimonial injustice, when basically we do not hear them, because we have our own prejudice and bias towards their knowledge. We are questioning the validity of their knowledge, as well as hermeneutical injustice, because we don't want to actually acknowledge them as a knowledge producer, right, in the academia. And going back to critical Romani studies, I think somehow we were able a little bit, making this space for a new knowledge, new conceptualization, as well as we brought several people who are guys who are sitting here in this room, and you joined online as well, to contribute to this discussion in a very meaningful and yes, in a subversive way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And again, first the panelists, if you want to react on something, other panelists, right? Time is flying. So I would like to move on to the, let's say, more practical aspects of access programs. Like, in a way, your access program experiences, any direct, indirect impact you experience, including Judith's point about the olive model. And also, because we have little time, maybe you can incorporate in this round the main obstacles, challenges, and also limitations of that specific program. Whoever would like to go first.
Anyway,
No.
you don't have to go in the same.
No. Okay, so I'm going to be really short. Do you hear me, Magda? Those who are online? Okay, so I think the constant challenges what we are facing, of course, the financial, support, what we are missing, right? As you know, that the RGPP is an externally funded program, so we have to write a project proposal, we have to justify why we are, what we are doing, and I think it's very tiresome and very draining for the leadership, of course, for the staff, but also it's just not sustainable, the program, if we're going to depend on external funding. I really hope that, we will find some universities, maybe CU is going to be one of that, who will devote some sources from their core budget and will support financially the access program in a very sustainable way.
Yeah, or I just thought.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's very wise. It's like Bertolt Brecht said, first the bread and then the morale. We need, but to make bread, we need flour, and to make research and education, we need funding and sustainable permanent funding, which is also protected by academic freedom, so nobody can come and cut it out. So I'm happy to see the development in Germany, in Heidelberg, that they managed to get the research center on anti-Gypsyism at Heidelberg University, which has a stable funding. My own university department certainly does not have a stable funding. It's extremely small, and we have elsewhere also problems. And access programs, I'm a bit of a sidekick in this because we don't have that system outside here, but we have the same goals, I think, and agree on many strategies. And this is why I think we should cooperate creatively as well. We create common research and education projects. Thank you.
So I said one of the main, or probably the main issue is funding. But I think one thing also was implicit in what Angela is saying is that we are severely under-resourced. So people involved in all the access programs I've worked with or been involved with or touched on or attended a conference about are usually precarious scholars or precarious staff working on short-term projects who do not have time to do the type of connective work that is required, and a type of everyone's scrambling. No one has time to sit and reflect and to build solidarities. I mean, David and I and others, you did Ignaz, others, Andrea and you did Veresh, all worked on, and Gina, all worked on Olive and IGP. There are solidarities that exist, but we all worked in this fragmented way. And I think it's important in order to, I don't have a solution to this at all, but I think what's important is to try to forge solidarities among people working across a range of different programs. It's not about people working programs for people, for Roma and people working on programs for displaced people, but it's people working on access for people who have been marginalized. And I think our curricula, our approaches are very common. Of course, there are differences, but they're very common. One thing I think is also very important to do, and we never really, as far as I know in CEU, had the resources, again, because most people involved were underfunded, precarious scholars or staff, was to step outside of the university. So those programs that I know that have sustainability are those that connected with municipalities, those that connected with institutions outside the university. So in Barcelona, there's a very successful and I think quite secure access program for displaced people. And they're secure because they connect with the municipality. The university can think what they like about them. The university supports them, but so does the municipality. So that their entire resources is not based on one institution, a university, who grants them existence or decides not to grant them existence. So it's harder maybe for a university like Central European University because we're private and we're a foreign university in Vienna, but maybe it's not in other countries, or maybe it's possible even in CEU. So I think it's important to try and step outside the university and to forge our common solidarities.
So I might build on that and just highlight very briefly three things. I was actually wanted to say something similar to Prem, but you said it much better. Thinking about this, I mean, part of this is how do we think about the relationship between different types of access initiatives? And there's both a conceptual tension, but also an operational and a budgetary tension, where we recognize the intersectionality of disadvantage. And on the one hand, this makes it very difficult and resource intensive to actually make a difference. And it is easy to do things. It is difficult to do things that matter. Also, how do we think about the complementarities between different access initiatives? And a lot of this, in particularly when you're looking at one institution or one context, we end up replicating this core periphery type of dichotomy in which access is often on the margins. And so, I mean, there are reasons for this, some of it related to visibility, the often overlooked nature of different groups, but also the ways in which the gaze of donors and of others can, it varies. It doesn't always look. And so often it looks like one group is now attracting attention, another group, and then sort of cycles out of the funding thing. So how do we think about not, and the solution cannot be simply asking for attention from an outside gaze, but what can we do ourselves so that we're not caught in that dynamic of being objects rather than subjects in this. And how do we think about if inequality is embedded in many institutions, how can we embed equality in the sinews of the same institutions? So.
Yes, a couple of points. One thing that I would say first, though, is that in so many ways, the Roma Access Program and RGPP and everything else, they are critical Romani studies, because many of the people who now critique institutions and scholarship and knowledge production, they are alumni of the CEU program, and I think we have to acknowledge their role, not only in knowledge production, but more so also in institutions, in changing parts of the world. So I'm very grateful for that. And at the same time, I think that my experience with the CEU alumni, and this, I thought about this listening to Prem and the idea of solidarity, but I think that on one hand, I agree with you that we need also this solidarity between groups and between oppressed communities, but at the same time, I see so much solidarity between various alumni of your program, Angela and Martin, and I don't know how that happens and why and in what context and if it is intentional, but I think that there is much more solidarity in this group of alumni than solidarity amongst us in the Roma movement. But that being said, I think that if I were to think about a challenge which is more conceptual, and it doesn't necessarily apply solely to the Roma Access Program, but more so to affirmative action programs in Serbia, Romania, and so on, it's the framing, which is not necessarily a framing that we could control, and this idea that these programs that ensure access are a response, at least according to many institutions, to poverty and social and economic challenges, whereas the framing to many of us is that these are responses to historical injustices, to the continuities and legacies of anti-Roma racism. And I think in some ways we face this pressure not to go into this direction because it's easier for the structures and those in power morally and legally and socially to see us as the object of research, as the object of policies and interventions and assimilation and integration, as opposed to subjects in this in all these conversations and policy making. So in a way, we talk about what Quijano calls the power of coloniality, although it's more so intra-coloniality in Europe. So I think that framing might be an issue that we could also look at. And of course, and I'm sorry, I was thinking that I would only take a minute for this, but maybe just let me also say that to a large extent, access programs have not really addressed the needs of the most marginalized, but I think, and it is not something that access programs can do, because you cannot really tackle the structural legacies and continuities of racism. But I think that most often what we see in such programs, including in affirmative action programs in countries in the region, is that those who can access are those who can find some opportunities to actually get to that point of being able to go to college. So we are talking mostly about people who have family members with higher education levels, or people involved in activism, people residing near Roma NGOs or leaders, or simply those who have access to the internet. And those factors and many others increase the likelihood of accessing such access programs or affirmative action programs or anything else. So I think that one conversation that Angela and I have had for a long time was really, how do we, push states and institutions to address the gap that we see, from primary education to high school.
Many thanks, Magda. David?
Just follow something that Angela was saying before. She was reflecting on the difficulty of institutional funding and why does that happen, and is there a lack of recognition of the value of this kind of access education? One of the things we hear so often is, oh, RGPP, it's too expensive, it costs so much. But what is this cost? I mean, really, if you think about people coming from a more conventional privileged pathway, how does that compare to their 5 years of previous yearly education compared to what this access program can do and affect change in a very short bridging period? And that's something which is really not recognized still by the institution, and is still a challenge which is ongoing, and that there isn't a value of the value of this program. And as Magda was saying, that people go on and they become part of critical Romani studies. This has to be recognized, valued, validated, and then hopefully that can change. But it's a slow process.
Many thanks. And I would like to open the floor for questions. So first, if anyone here sitting in the room has questions, then please raise them. And then we will have a round with the online participants too. Yes, please.
There's one, I'm not sure. I think they can hear you if you speak up here.
Yeah.
And the mic here, if you
There
like.
is a classroom microphone here.
Okay. So I have just a question. So whether in upcoming years, maybe RGPP or the access program thinks about maybe shaping, like in another manner, the whole preparatory, the program or the planning. I was like listening, and I heard that the sponsors or the people who would like to support the program want to see the leadership of the enrolled ones. The question is whether the program would like to work in two manners, from manners of academic sphere, where we will provide education and a so-called educational access, which is for me a super narrow something. We have to, I think, nowadays work in a way, in a manner of a leadership as well. So maybe the program should establish another team, which would be like super just targeted to work with the enrolled one in terms of leadership. Maybe just a question if there is any plans to support the preparation of the leaders.
Maybe 1, 2 more questions, and then. You did, you don't want to repeat one or two? Do I have some?
No, my real question is whether you could challenge the whole system of this reproduction of inequality in higher education from the mainstream, from inside the belly of the university as a marketized education, higher education field, or you should stay like Olive, a bit on the margin and try to find some support from, as you said, municipalities or private donors, or so I don't know whether the space of the wood or land, the space of margin is more a space for transformation, solidarity, change, or you can imagine it in this, in the underbelly of this very horrible institution like higher education, that you have to pay extortionate fees. So where you have to always provide excellence reports, the social impact of your work. So how do you feel about being on the margin or being in the mainstream?
I cannot exactly answer your question in as you pose it, but related to that, I think it is necessary and legitimate to promote Roma scholarship, and that is also, it's nothing wrong with how do you say, supporting, opening up the pathways all the way up to becoming professors. I hope in 10 or 20 years that the whole situation is different, and this is necessary, and this is also related to changing the marginalized situation. And I think this should not be put in opposite to each other, which is often being done, and that's part of the ideological discussion, that they say that this is only. I hear this many times. This is just an elite thing, and I think it's wrong. And I see the results now. We have Romani lawyers, we have Roma PhDs, we have who speak at the same level, who have a different access of to the power institutions in society in the long run. That's necessary.
Just a minute, but we will take your questions for sure. If anyone needs to react to Angela.
Prem as well. Okay, just very shortly, I think it's somehow it's related to both questions which were raised by Miki as well as by Judith. So I really believe that we need both places actually. The margin, like outside the formal higher education, but also we have to be there. It's much harder, more challenging, but I think we have to be there, and even our presence. We used to, talk about it with Vicky, right? That it really means something if we are in the room. So even though that if we're not gonna say that much, right? Because usually those spaces are not like that, where you can feel safe and where you can speak freely, but still your presence has a meaning. And I think that's really important. And I really hope that, the next generation is going to be more talkative and more radical and more subversive. But I really believe that our presence has a significance at CU as well as in higher education in a broader term. Although, as you told as well, that margin is always offers some kind of creative space, and we can imagine the higher education in a different way, as we are doing internally, as well as like being as an outsider Like even in the case of Roma Access, we have a Roma Versitas, which is an NGO outside of the higher education, but we have Roma Access programs at CU, and RGPP is part of that. And going back to the leadership, I really believe that, that even though that it's called academic, but people whom we are preparing, whom we are supporting, and they're gonna be leaders. Like you are working in a Slovak government, right? Isma is in or he's been a former member of the parliament in Spain and working in the European Parliament right now, and many others, or NGO leaders, and I'm thinking about it in these days. Actually, what we are doing as a Roma Access programs, we are doing this very invisible social reproductive work for the Roma movement and for the bureaucracy, European bureaucracy as well, and it doesn't necessary. I mean, if we would have a lot of money and specific grant for that, and definitely it could have been one of the professional program as well. But I think it's still a part of that we are educating people who's going to be leaders on their field.
Thank you. Just quickly, I can't speak to the leadership question, but I'll speak more generally to Judith's question or Judith's comments. So I agree with Angela. I think it's important to occupy both margin and center, but also the question that the division between the two. I think, well, first of all, I think that the Roma Access programs over the last 20 years has transformed this university. I think it's important to acknowledge that. The university today cannot be imagined without the history of the Roma Access programs. And I think we're so caught up in trying to defend our position that sometimes we don't see what has actually been achieved. The university has transformed fundamentally. I've been here for 20 years since the Roma Access program started, and the university has gone lots of changes, but certainly there has been this transformative impact. I think Olive had the same transformative impact at a much lower degree because we're a smaller, younger program. And the Olive model of being outside is because we were forced to there. And I think this is the issue. I think it points to what David is talking about, which is about value. Everything is thought in terms of costs, and imagine comparisons of the cost of an access programs against I don't know what, that we're expensive. I mean, expensive is a relational term, it doesn't exist by itself. So, and I think what has happened recently in the university over the last 2 or 3 years is not just a question of valuing, but an active devaluing of access programs. And that's a problem. And we're not just struggling to make ourselves heard, we're struggling to not be devalued. And that's a problem. But in the question of transforming the university, I think that's been done. And I, despite my critiques of the university I do all the time, I am a great believer in the university. I agree with one of Judith's questions about the classroom as a radical transformative space, and not just for the university, but for society. I think universities have increasingly closed themselves off from society, but the university, remembering what it is, it has a strong public role, which is about the production and dissemination of knowledge and the renewal of knowledge. And that renewal happens by getting different types of people into the university who can participate in knowledge production. I think the main thing I want to say is that we have transformed this university already, and I hope other universities as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was firstly, thank you for the comments at the end of the table, because what sparks my question came from, I think it's David. My eyesight isn't what it used to be.
David, yeah.
That the access programs here have been transformative over the last 20 years. But it was David that my question, which was about the money and the funding. I'm going to do a presentation later about the UK situation and the pledge. And that's a free action, that's a free initiative, but it's the institutional will is lacking. And that's the barrier there. There's no funding issues really. It's the institutional will that's lacking in the UK. I just kind of wanted to make that point. It's less of a question, but I just kind of wanted to tag that on.
Many thanks. Yes, Liana, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, to present myself, my name is Milena. I am one of alumni, students from RGPP and from Master in Human Rights. And my question is related to the also previous presentation, but also to the all what you mentioned already for the future of critical social science that you already mentioned. Do you have? It's maybe general questions, but I would like to hear your thoughts about it. Do you have a fear of a future of social science, of interest of students of social science, is having in mind the current situation in the world, global situation, and this lack of trust in international law, efficiency of international law, and as Michael mentioned, in individual and collective rights, if we are speaking about situation in the field and in the reality, is there this decreasing interest in social science in general? It is kind of what are my thoughts, and I would like to hear from you some kind of feedback about it. Thank you.
Many thanks. Judith, yes, please.
It's a bit different from your question, but very thank you for asking as well this question. Angela and everyone who just running this program, do you see shaping Roma business middle class who could be your donor? So where is it? Is it like coming into shaping, or they just don't want to really give back, to their community? So the question is that in this special issue what we edited at ABE, we have authors who studied the Mexican immigrants into LA, and the Mexican immigrants just formed a very strong, financially strong class who give back to their community to foster the social mobility of Mexican immigrants in LA. It's in their own very well thought interest, because in this way they really fostered their own communities, and nowadays they outnumbered the majority Americans. So is there any hope that we will have
Sure that hope is always
critical hope
on the horizon? And we have a couple of students actually who are enrolled in business administration and business analytics. We hope they. No, I'm just joking. But I mean, no, because I think it's just think about it, that how many Roma are the one who enrolled in higher education in Europe? Less than 1%. And even this 400 has been graduated from the Roma access programs. It's a tiny, fragile group, what we are talking about. It doesn't mean that we don't have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 guys who are terribly rich and they really enjoying their cars and so on. And I think, I'm sure, I really hope that they will contribute, or somehow we will have some substantial number of upper middle class Roma who will support the program, but I think we are not yet at that stage, I would say.
Attached to what you're saying, I think maybe I think a bit like a Swedish socialist, but I think that is the wrong end to walk around and ask for private gifts. I think major society should pay this, and that should be the political demand. The Germans were very successful, as I said, they got this center, and this is also being discussed at the European levels. The new EU strategies for the so-called Roma inclusion, they also address this, the need for a knowledge production, and then this is, I think, where to get the money.
Mirjana, we will go back to your question. So you touched upon knowledge production, but Mirjana also raised the future of social science.
I had an answer to that question if you allow me,
do,
or
Margareta.
at least just not answer, but add a few thoughts in addition to Miranda's comments. And I think that the one is really related to this idea of decreasing interest in social science. And I think that for me, it's not my fear is not necessarily about a decreasing interest. My fear is about an intentional fight against critical studies, against intersectionality, against justice studies, against anti-racism studies. And this is something that we see in various countries, from the United States to other places. So we are in a point in a moment in history when knowledge production that is critical, and scholars who critique states or critique institutions prohibited to enter a country or another. Just think about Nancy Fraser and what Nancy Fraser means for the scholarship, and how much resistance has been in Germany and other places against her. So I'm very worried about this intentional pattern of silencing voices that are critical. And I think there is space for all of us, if we ought to engage in these solidarity conversations and co-center Roma in these conversations, to know that these fights against critique and critical studies and anti-racism would also impact the Romani scholarship, and there is a way for us to contribute to this conversation and have allies that would fight together with us against this silencing approach. And maybe just quickly on this idea of individual versus collective rights and all other dichotomies, one thing that I would say is that either or will not help us as a paradigm. I think that there is space to build on what we have, but there is space also for radical transformation. So probably I will just finish here by saying that, I personally, I'm a believer in individual human rights. And at the same time, I believe that structural injustices and structural inequities require structural solutions. And therefore, there is space for us to integrate this in our new thinking, in the way in which we can imagine a better Europe, if you want.
Many thanks, Magda. And sadly, we more or less had this much time, so I would like to ask Angela whether she would like to say some final comment.
I don't know if it's final comments or just a thought. I was thinking about that when you talked about the critical hope, right? And considering about the present situation in higher education, like humanities and social studies are really in a precarious situation. And something which just came up in my mind, that Walter Benjamin. So if we would read more Walter Benjamin, probably we would be in a better position. And there is a quote, actually, you can find in his writings, volume 1, and also Herbert Marcus referred to that. It is only for the sake of those without hope that hope is given to us. I think it's just so beautiful and really encapsulate what we try to do, even with this tiny program, right? To giving a hope for those people who are in the very destitute and very horrible condition, and who has no hope really that once their child is going to be in a higher education. And I think what you are representing, guys, is a hope. And I really hope that you are a hope for your own community as well. And I think somehow it's just such a beautiful thing to remember to the day of resistance, right? May 16. And what we are doing here actually to give a little hope for those who do not possess that kind of hope what we have.
Indeed, you made it into a final comment. So I thank all the audience. Like